I am Mackenzie Sullivan, 34 years old, and last Tuesday I became the youngest judge in Middlesex County. The journey here was long, especially with a sister like Heather who always made me feel second best. Years of hard work, sleepless nights, and dedication finally paid off despite my family never believing in me. Little did I know, all of it would culminate in a courtroom showdown where Heather would call me worthless to my face. If you are watching this, drop a comment letting me know where you are from. Hit that like button and subscribe to see how karma finally served my sister the reality check she deserved. Growing up in a middle-class neighborhood in Boston shaped me in ways I never fully appreciated until adulthood. Our house on Maple Street was modest but comfortable, with 4 bedrooms and a small backyard where my father Harold would grill every Sunday during summer. From the outside, we probably looked like the perfect American family. But appearances can be deceiving. From my earliest memories, it was clear that my sister Heather, just 2 years older than me, was the golden child. With her naturally blonde hair, bright blue eyes, and effortless charm, she captivated everyone around her, especially our parents. Deborah and Harold Sullivan made no secret of their favoritism. While they never explicitly said it, their actions spoke volumes. Heather got her looks from my side of the family. My mother would proudly tell neighbors, friends, or anyone who would listen. Meanwhile, I inherited my father's more ordinary features, brown hair that refused to hold a curl, and a serious disposition that made me seem older than my years. By age 10, I had already developed a keen interest in justice and fairness, perhaps because I experienced so little of it at home. I would organize courts with my stuffed animals, carefully weighing evidence before delivering verdicts. Heather thought it was weird. My parents barely noticed. "Mackenzie, honey, why not try cheerleading like your sister?" My mother suggested repeatedly. "You might make more friends." The implication was clear: be more like Heather. Our family dinners were exercises in invisibility for me. While my parents would enthusiastically discuss Heather's latest achievements in cheerleading, her popularity at school, or her prospects for homecoming queen, my straight A's and academic achievements were acknowledged with distracted nods. "That's nice, dear," my mother would say when I mentioned winning the regional debate championship, before immediately turning to Heather. "Now tell us more about your modeling audition." The pattern continued throughout high school. When I was selected for a prestigious summer law program at Boston University, my father merely asked if it would take up the whole summer. That same week, they spent $3,000 on professional photos for Heather's modeling portfolio without hesitation. My high school graduation should have been my moment. As valedictorian, I had worked for 4 years to earn the right to deliver that speech. I spent weeks perfecting every word, hoping that finally my parents would see my value. The morning of graduation, I came downstairs in my cap and gown to find my parents frantically making phone calls. "Heather just found out she won the state beauty pageant," my mother exclaimed, barely glancing at me. "We need to arrange a celebration for tonight." I delivered my speech to a packed auditorium, but my parents were distracted, constantly checking their phones for updates about Heather's win. At the ceremony's end, they rushed me through photos so we could get to Heather's celebration dinner on time. My achievement became a footnote on my sister's day. College decisions brought more of the same. Despite being accepted to Harvard, Yale, and Stanford, my parents seemed more concerned about how they would pay for it. "We've already committed quite a bit to Heather's modeling career," my father explained awkwardly. "It's an investment in her future. You understand, right? You're the smart one. You'll figure it out." And figure it out I did. I took out loans, worked part-time jobs, and applied for every scholarship available. I waited tables, shelved books at the library, and tutored other students. Every summer, I worked multiple jobs while Heather traveled to modeling gigs, her expenses covered by our parents. Through it all, I maintained my focus on my goal: becoming an attorney. Law school at Harvard was even more demanding, but I thrived on the challenge. While I lived in a tiny apartment with 3 roommates, eating ramen and working 20 hours a week, Heather moved to New York with a generous allowance from our parents to pursue modeling full-time. Our paths diverged further during those years. I called home less frequently, finding the conversations increasingly strained. My parents seemed to have little interest in my law school experiences, and I had little patience for hearing about Heather's latest photo shoot or celebrity party. By the time I graduated from law school, summa cum laude, the distance between us was no longer just geographical. When my parents called to say they couldn't attend my graduation because Heather had a major campaign shoot that weekend, I wasn't even surprised. Disappointed, yes, but not surprised. "We're really proud of you, Mackenzie," my father said over the phone. "You know that, right?" But I didn't know that. Their actions had never shown pride in me, and words alone weren't enough anymore. That was the moment I decided to create my own definition of success and family. I would build a life and career based on my values, not on seeking approval I would never receive. Little did I know then how completely our worlds would collide years later, or that the family dynamics established in those early years would play out in the most public and dramatic way possible. Harvard Law School was exactly as challenging as I'd anticipated, but I was prepared for the workload. While many of my classmates came from privileged backgrounds with family legacies at the school, I had something they didn't: hunger. I had something to prove, not just to my family, but to myself. I graduated at the top of my class, an achievement that opened doors but also set expectations incredibly high. While most of my classmates headed to lucrative positions at prestigious firms, I chose a different path. I became a public defender in downtown Boston, working with clients who had nothing and needed someone to stand up for them. "You're doing what?" Heather had asked incredulously during a rare phone call. "With your grades, you could be making six figures at any firm in the country." "Not everything is about money," I replied, though I knew the concept was foreign to her. My tiny office in the public defender's building became my second home. I worked from dawn until well past dusk, often sleeping on the uncomfortable couch when trials ran late. My clients were people society had written off: drug addicts, petty thieves, the homeless, the mentally ill. Many of my Harvard classmates couldn't understand why I'd waste my talent on such cases, but every time I helped someone get a fair shake in a system designed to overlook them, I felt a sense of purpose no corporate law firm could have provided. After 3 years as a public defender, I made another career move that surprised many. I accepted a position as a prosecutor. Switching sides, my former boss had asked with raised eyebrows. Seeking justice from all angles, I corrected him. "I want to understand the full spectrum of our legal system." As a prosecutor, I developed a reputation for being tough but fair. I didn't seek maximum penalties when circumstances didn't warrant them, and I wasn't afraid to drop charges when evidence was insufficient. My colleagues sometimes thought I was too soft, but I was building something more important than a conviction record: integrity. While I was working 80-hour weeks, living in a modest one-bedroom apartment, and driving a 10-year-old Honda, Heather was living a very different life. Through social media and occasional family updates, I learned she had married Jason Adams, heir to a real estate development fortune. They lived in a penthouse in Manhattan, traveled constantly, and seemed to exist in a different universe than mine. At 34, the most unexpected opportunity arrived. Judge Eleanor Richardson, a well-respected jurist in our district, announced her retirement and recommended me as her replacement. Despite my relatively young age, my reputation for fairness and my unique experience on both sides of the courtroom made me a compelling candidate. The nomination process was grueling. Every aspect of my personal and professional life was scrutinized. My youth was repeatedly questioned, with some suggesting I lacked the life experience necessary for the position. But Judge Richardson's endorsement carried significant weight, and after months of interviews and hearings, I received the call. I would be the youngest judge appointed to the district court in Massachusetts history. The swearing-in ceremony was held on a Tuesday afternoon in the same courthouse where I'd tried my first case as a public defender. The room was filled with colleagues, mentors, and friends I'd made throughout my career. Notably absent was my family. I'd sent invitations to my parents and Heather, but received only a brief congratulatory text from my father claiming they had prior commitments. As I raised my right hand and took the oath, I felt a complex mix of emotions. Pride in my accomplishment, gratitude to those who had supported me, and a lingering sadness that the people who should have been proudest were not there to witness this milestone. The first months on the bench brought new challenges. Some attorneys, particularly older ones, seemed determined to test me, perhaps hoping my youth would translate to inexperience they could exploit. I quickly dispelled those notions with thorough knowledge of the law and a courtroom demeanor that balanced authority with respect. Judge Sullivan runs the tightest courtroom in the district. I overheard one attorney tell another outside my chambers one day. The comment gave me more satisfaction than any praise from my family ever had. My personal life, however, remained sparse. Dating was nearly impossible with my schedule and the ethical constraints of my position. Potential romantic interests were often either intimidated by my title or inappropriately attracted to the power it represented. The few relationships I attempted fizzled quickly when partners realized they would always come second to my career. My apartment remained sparsely furnished. Not from lack of means, but lack of time to create a home. I ate most meals at my desk, celebrated birthdays with colleagues rather than family, and spent holidays catching up on case reviews. The loneliness was sometimes acute, but I had made my choice. Success required sacrifice. Meanwhile, through occasional calls with my parents, I learned that Heather and Jason had become fixtures in New York's social scene. Their faces appeared in society pages, at charity galas, and exclusive events. Heather had transitioned from modeling to influencing, whatever that meant, and seemed to have the life she'd always wanted. What none of us realized then was how quickly that gilded life could tarnish, or how dramatically our separate worlds would soon collide. The first signs of Heather's downfall weren't immediately obvious to me. Our lives had diverged so completely that news came to me secondhand, usually through brief, awkward calls with my parents. At first, the changes seemed innocuous enough. Heather's modeling agency didn't renew her contract, my mother mentioned during one of our monthly calls. But she says that's fine because she's focusing on her social media presence now. Did you know she has over 100,000 followers? People send her free products just to post about them. I murmured appropriate responses while reviewing case notes, only half listening. It didn't occur to me then that at 36, Heather was facing the brutal reality of an industry that valued youth above all else. A few months later, my father called with news that Heather and Jason had purchased a vacation home in the Hamptons. "It's right on the beach," he said proudly. 5 bedrooms, a pool, the works. "They've invited us to stay next summer." The extravagance seemed excessive even for them, but I didn't question it. I was in the middle of a high-profile homicide trial and had more pressing concerns than my sister's real estate investments. It wasn't until a year later that more troubling updates began to surface. My mother called late one evening, her voice strained. "Your father's had some health issues," she said. "Nothing serious, just high blood pressure and some heart concerns. The doctor says he needs to reduce stress. Is he planning to retire?" I asked, concerned despite our distant relationship. "Well, that's the thing," she hesitated. "We've had to dip into his retirement fund quite a bit over the past few years. Heather and Jason needed some help with investments. And you know how your father can never say no to her." This caught my attention. "How much help?" "Just loans," she said quickly. "They'll pay us back when Jason's new development project comes through." A sense of unease settled over me. I knew enough about finance to understand that people with truly successful investments don't need to borrow money from their retired parents. Over the next 2 years, more concerning patterns emerged. My parents sold their home of 30 years and downsized to a small condo, claiming they wanted less maintenance, but I suspected financial necessity. Meanwhile, Heather's social media continued to showcase an increasingly lavish lifestyle at odds with what I was hearing about Jason's business. Through professional connections, I discreetly learned that Jason's real estate company was under financial strain. Several projects had failed to secure proper permits, investors were pulling out, and there were rumors of corner cutting on building materials. None of this was public knowledge yet, but in my position, I heard things. During a rare face-to-face meeting when my parents visited Boston, my father, aged beyond his years, admitted they were a little concerned about Heather. "She seems different," he said carefully, "more focused on appearances than ever. When we visit, she's always rushing to some event or another. And between us, I think she might be drinking too much." My mother quickly changed the subject, still protective of her favorite child, but the admission troubled me. Despite our differences, Heather was still my sister. I tried calling her directly for the first time in years. She answered, clearly intoxicated despite it being early afternoon. Well, if it isn't Judge Judy," she slurred. "To what do I owe this honor, Your Honor?" She laughed at her own joke. "Mom and Dad are worried about you," I said, skipping pleasantries. "Is everything okay with you and Jason?" "Everything's fabulous," she snapped, suddenly defensive. "We're doing better than ever. In fact, we just booked a month in Monaco. Not all of us want to live like nuns, Mackenzie." The call ended shortly after, resolving nothing. But 6 months later, the situation exploded into public view. Jason Adams was arrested on multiple charges of wire fraud, investor fraud, and money laundering. His successful business had allegedly been a sophisticated Ponzi scheme, using new investor money to pay returns to earlier investors while he and Heather lived extravagantly on the proceeds. The news broke in all major outlets, with particular attention paid to the couple's excessive spending while investors lost millions. Photos of their Manhattan penthouse, Hampton's home, luxury cars, and private jet travels were splashed across newspapers and websites. Heather, once celebrated for her glamorous lifestyle, was now portrayed as the greedy, superficial wife of a criminal. My parents called in a panic. "They've frozen all their assets," my mother sobbed. "Heather has nothing. They're saying she might be implicated too. That she had to have known where the money was coming from." I maintained professional distance, explaining that I couldn't discuss potential criminal matters, especially ones that might eventually come before a court in my district. Privately, though, I worried that Heather's spending habits and social media documentation of their lifestyle would make it difficult to claim ignorance of Jason's crimes. Jason was released on bail, but confined to their Manhattan apartment with an ankle monitor. Heather, though not yet charged, had her passport confiscated as a flight risk. Their assets remained frozen pending investigation. What happened next confirmed my worst fears about how deeply Heather had been involved. Rather than cooperating with authorities or maintaining a low profile, she embarked on an increasingly desperate campaign to maintain appearances. She borrowed money from friends until they stopped answering her calls. She tried selling her designer clothes and jewelry, only to discover that many items were being claimed as assets purchased with fraudulent funds. When those avenues closed, she turned back to our parents. "She's completely cleaned them out," a family friend informed me discreetly. "Your father had to come out of retirement and take a job as a night security guard at 72 years old. Your mother's selling her jewelry, even her wedding ring. They're behind on their condo payments." The final straw came when Heather was caught attempting to sell counterfeit luxury handbags, claiming they were authentic items from her personal collection. This desperate scheme resulted in her arrest for fraud, separate from Jason's case, but equally serious. As the investigation progressed, evidence mounted that Heather had been more than just a beneficiary of Jason's crimes. Emails and text messages showed she had actively participated in misleading investors, had knowingly used fraudulent funds to make purchases, and had even helped hide assets when investigations began. The Heather who had once been the golden child, always favored and protected, now faced serious criminal charges of her own. And, through a twist of fate neither of us could have imagined, her case was about to land in my jurisdiction. The formal charges against Heather came down on a Wednesday morning: conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering, and obstruction of justice. The case was assigned to the Eastern District of Massachusetts, my district, though not initially to my courtroom. Judge William Franklin, my mentor and friend, was scheduled to preside over her preliminary hearing. I first learned of the assignment through a court clerk who casually mentioned it, unaware of my relationship to the defendant. "That socialite fraud case is coming up next week," she said, placing a stack of files on my desk. "Judge Franklin's got it. Should be interesting, given all the media attention." I froze, then carefully asked, "Heather Adams? That case is coming here?" "Yes, apparently the conspiracy charges include activities that occurred in our jurisdiction." "Why do you ask?" I maintained my composure while explaining that Heather Adams was my sister. The clerk's eyes widened with shock. "I'll need to speak with Judge Franklin immediately," I said, already reaching for my phone. Judge Franklin was understanding but concerned. "This puts you in an impossible position, Mackenzie. Even if you're not the presiding judge, having a family member tried in your own courthouse creates potential conflicts." "I understand," I replied. "I'll maintain complete separation from the case. No one even needs to know we're related." "Does she know you're a judge here?" he asked. "I doubt it," I admitted. "We haven't spoken in over a year. And she's never shown interest in my career." The ethical guidelines were clear. I would recuse myself from any involvement in her case and maintain absolute professional distance. I would not discuss the case with colleagues, attend any proceedings, or access any case files. As long as another judge handled the matter, there would be no ethical violation. For 5 days, I adhered strictly to the separation. I avoided the courthouse cafeteria and took different routes to my chambers to minimize the chance of encountering Heather during pre-trial proceedings. I declined to comment when colleagues made references to the celebrity fraud case, citing judicial ethics. Then, the unexpected happened. Judge Franklin suffered a heart attack 2 days before Heather's preliminary hearing. He was hospitalized and expected to recover, but obviously could not preside over court matters in the immediate future. The chief judge called an emergency meeting of available judges to redistribute Franklin's caseload. As the newest judge with the lightest docket, I was assigned several of his cases. "I can take everything except the Adams case," I said immediately. "The defendant is my sister." The chief judge looked startled. "You never mentioned this before." "I didn't think it would become relevant as long as Judge Franklin was handling it," I explained. "But now I need to formally recuse myself." He frowned, checking the court calendar. "This is problematic. The hearing is scheduled for tomorrow, and we're already short-handed with Franklin out. Every other judge is in trial or has conflicts of their own. Surely someone can reschedule something," I pressed. "This is a clear conflict of interest." "The defendant has already been granted several delays at her attorney's request," he countered. "The prosecution is pushing hard against any further postponements." We debated the matter for nearly an hour. The chief judge consulted with the court's ethics advisor by phone, exploring all possible options. Finally, he made a decision I never expected. The ethics advisor believes you can preside over the preliminary hearing under these extraordinary circumstances. It's just a procedural matter to set bail and hearing dates, not to determine guilt or innocence. As long as you disclose the relationship and offer the defense an opportunity to request another judge, you'll have fulfilled your ethical obligation. "But that would mean revealing our relationship in open court," I protested. "The media would have a field day." "Which is preferable? Temporary media attention or accusations that our court delayed justice due to special treatment for a well-connected defendant?" he asked pointedly. He was right, and I knew it. The principles of justice I had dedicated my life to upholding demanded that cases be heard promptly, without unnecessary delays. My personal discomfort couldn't outweigh that. "I'll do it." I finally agreed. "But I want the disclosure and recusal option presented to her attorney before she enters the courtroom, giving them the chance to accept or request reassignment without public spectacle." The chief judge agreed to this compromise. We arranged for the court clerk to speak privately with Heather's attorney first thing in the morning, before the hearing began. That night was one of the longest of my life. I reviewed the ethical guidelines repeatedly, practiced what I would say if forced to disclose our relationship in open court, and prepared myself for every possible scenario, including Heather's potential reaction to seeing me on the bench. Morning arrived after a nearly sleepless night. I dressed with particular care in my most formal judicial attire, my black robe meticulously pressed. I arrived at the courthouse 2 hours early, using the private judicial entrance and taking refuge in my chambers. At 8:15 a.m., the court clerk knocked on my door. I spoke with Ms. Adams' attorney as instructed, she reported. He seemed surprised, but said he needed to consult with his client before making any decision about requesting a different judge. And? I prompted when she hesitated. Ms. Adams refused to believe you're a judge here. She accused her attorney of making it up as some kind of bizarre legal strategy and demanded to proceed as scheduled. She was quite adamant. I closed my eyes briefly. Of course Heather wouldn't believe it. In her mind, I was still the invisible sister, the one whose achievements didn't count. The attorney apologizes but says Ms. Adams is insisting on moving forward. He looks quite uncomfortable with the situation. As am I murmured. But we proceed according to protocol. The hearing begins at 9 a.m. sharp. For the next 45 minutes, I reviewed the case file, familiarizing myself with the charges and evidence to be presented. The facts were damning. Heather had been far more involved in Jason's schemes than even I had suspected, actively participating in defrauding investors and concealing assets. At precisely 8:55 a.m., I took a deep breath and prepared to enter the courtroom from my chambers. The bailiff waited for my signal. "The courtroom is full, Your Honor," he warned. "Press in the back row. The defendant is already seated with her counsel." I nodded, straightening my shoulders. "Then let's proceed." The door opened, and I stepped into what would become the most extraordinary courtroom confrontation of my career. About to face a sister who had no idea that the judge she was about to disrespect held not just her legal fate, but a lifetime of shared history in her hands. "All rise." The Honorable Judge Mackenzie Sullivan presiding. The bailiff's voice echoed through courtroom 4B as I entered from the side door connected to my chambers. The room was indeed packed to capacity, with reporters lining the back wall and every seat filled. The air felt charged with anticipation, the kind reserved for high-profile cases that promise drama. I kept my eyes forward as I approached the bench, maintaining the dignity the position demanded. Only once I was seated did I allow myself to scan the courtroom, my gaze finally settling on the defendant's table. Heather sat beside her attorney, a distinguished-looking man in his 50s whom I recognized as Martin Geller, one of Boston's most expensive defense lawyers. She wore a conservative navy blue suit, her hair pulled back in a severe bun, clearly dressed to project an image of respectability. Even from a distance, I could see she had lost weight since her arrest, her once perfectly rounded cheeks now angular and tense. For a moment, our eyes met, and I watched the progression of emotions cross her face, confusion, disbelief, and then dawning horror as recognition set in. Her perfectly manicured hand gripped her attorney's arm so tightly that he turned to her with concern. "This court is now in session," I announced, my voice steady despite the thundering of my heart. "We're here for the preliminary hearing in the case of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts versus Heather Sullivan Adams." I had barely finished the sentence when Heather shot to her feet, shaking off her attorney's restraining hand. "This is a joke, right?" she demanded, her voice piercing the formal atmosphere of the courtroom. "Is this some kind of sick prank?" "Ms. Adams, you will address the court with respect or be held in contempt," I stated evenly. Her face contorted with rage. You? You are the judge?" This worthless nobody pretending to be someone important. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Her attorney stood quickly, trying to control the situation, but Heather shoved him away. "Your Honor, I apologize for my client," Mr. Geller said desperately. "May we request a brief recess?" But Heather was beyond control. "No, I will not be judged by my pathetic excuse for a sister. She's always been jealous of me. This is her revenge fantasy." The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Janelle Washington, rose from her seat. "Your Honor, if I may, does defense counsel's statement indicate there's a conflict of interest that should be addressed?" Before I could respond, Heather's tirade continued, growing more personal and vicious with each word. "Look at her sitting up there like she matters," she spat, gesturing wildly toward me. The plain, boring sister who could never get a date, who had no friends, whose only accomplishment was having her nose stuck in books while I was living a real life. The bailiff moved toward Heather, but I raised my hand slightly, signaling him to wait. As painful as her words were, they were revealing the truth of our relationship to everyone present, making my next steps clearer. "You're worthless scum, Mackenzie," Heather shouted, her face flushed with anger. "You always have been. Playing dress-up in that ridiculous robe doesn't change that. I demand a real judge." The courtroom had fallen into shocked silence. Even the reporters, normally scrambling to document every sensational moment, seemed frozen by the unexpected personal drama unfolding before them. I took a measured breath before speaking. "Ms. Adams, you are addressing a duly appointed judge of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Your personal relationship with the court does not give you license to disrupt these proceedings." "Personal relationship," she scoffed. "We have no relationship. You think becoming a small-time local judge makes you special? My husband and I had dinner with real judges, federal judges, Supreme Court justices. You're nothing." Her attorney appeared mortified, whispering urgently in her ear, but she shook him off again. "I refuse to be tried by her," Heather declared to the room. "She's not qualified to judge a dog show, let alone my case. This is a conflict of interest." "On that point, Ms. Adams, we agree," I said calmly. "There is indeed a conflict of interest, which is why I attempted to have this case reassigned. Your refusal to acknowledge the situation when your attorney approached you this morning has led to this unfortunate public display." This seemed to momentarily confuse her. "What are you talking about? Nobody told me anything about you." Mr. Geller cleared his throat nervously. "I did try to explain, Heather. When the court informed me that Judge Sullivan was your sister, I told you immediately, but you—" "This is insane." Heather cut him off, turning back to me. "You expect me to believe my little sister somehow became a judge? That's ridiculous. She's nobody." The bailiff finally reached Heather's side. "Ma'am, you need to compose yourself or you will be removed from the courtroom." "Remove her?" Heather pointed at me. "She's the fraud here. She's impersonating someone important." At that moment, the side door opened and the chief judge entered, likely drawn by the commotion echoing through the courthouse. He approached the bench and leaned toward me. "Judge Sullivan, do you need assistance?" he asked, his formal address unmistakable to everyone in the courtroom. "Thank you, Chief Judge Morris," I replied, ensuring my voice carried. "I believe we're experiencing some unexpected complications regarding my relationship to the defendant." The look on Heather's face as she heard the chief judge address me by my title was something I will never forget. It was as if her entire worldview was crumbling before her eyes. The color drained from her face, and for the first time since I'd entered the courtroom, she fell silent. "Good morning, Your Honor," the chief judge said clearly, nodding respectfully to me before turning to address the court. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to clarify for the record that Judge Mackenzie Sullivan is indeed a properly appointed and highly respected member of this court. Any suggestion otherwise is incorrect and potentially contemptuous." Heather sank slowly back into her chair, the fight visibly leaving her body as reality finally settled in. Her attorney looked relieved, but still deeply concerned. "In light of the revealed familial relationship," I stated formally, "this court has no choice but to recuse itself from these proceedings. Chief Judge Morris, I request that you reassign this case immediately to ensure the defendant receives a fair and impartial hearing." "So ordered," he replied. "This court is in recess until 2:00 p.m., at which time Judge Lawrence will preside over the preliminary hearing. Defendant will remain in custody until that time." As the bailiff called out, "All rise," again, I stood and made my way back to my chambers, maintaining my composure despite feeling as though every eye in the room was boring into my back. Only when the door closed behind me did I allow my shoulders to slump and the mask of judicial impartiality to fall away. What had just happened was unprecedented in my career and would undoubtedly make headlines by lunchtime. The sister who had spent a lifetime making me feel worthless had just proclaimed that worthlessness to a packed courtroom, only to discover that the person she was demeaning held significant power and respect, more, perhaps, than she ever had even at the height of her social climbing. It wasn't victory I felt, though. Sitting alone in my chambers, watching my hands shake slightly as the adrenaline ebbed, I felt only a profound sadness for the broken relationship that had just been exposed so publicly, and uncertainty about what would come next. The door to my chambers had barely closed when my phone began ringing. I ignored it, knowing it would be reporters seeking comment on the extraordinary scene that had just played out. Instead, I sank into my chair and allowed myself 5 minutes of private emotional release, something I rarely permitted during working hours. A gentle knock interrupted my thoughts. Judge Sullivan. It was Diane, my court clerk, her voice tentative. Chief Judge Morris would like to see you when you're ready. I composed myself quickly. I'll be right there. Chief Judge Morris had been a mentor since my appointment to the bench. His office was a sanctuary of old-world legal dignity, with leather-bound law books lining the walls and a desk that had belonged to a Massachusetts judge from the 1800s. Sit down, Mackenzie, he said, foregoing formality. That was quite a situation. I apologize for the disruption, I began, but he waved it away. You have nothing to apologize for. You handled yourself with remarkable restraint and professionalism under extraordinary circumstances. He leaned forward. But I am concerned about you personally. That was your sister. Yes, I confirmed. We've been estranged for years. He nodded thoughtfully. Family cases are always the hardest, even for seasoned judges. Take the rest of the day. The media is already swarming the courthouse, and you deserve some privacy. I started to protest, but realized he was right. Thank you. I think that would be best. As predicted. Reporters were gathered at the judge's private exit, somehow having discovered my escape route. I declined all requests for comment, hurrying to my car with my head down. By the time I reached my apartment, my phone had over 30 missed calls from unknown numbers and twice as many text messages. One text caught my attention. It was from my father. We saw the news. Are you okay? Can we talk? It was the first time in years he had reached out to me without some prompting. I texted back a simple yes and waited for his call. When the phone rang 20 minutes later, I was surprised to hear my mother's voice as well. They were on speakerphone. Mackenzie, my father began, sounding older than I remembered. We had no idea about the hearing today. We didn't know Heather's case would be in your court. Neither did I, until yesterday, I replied. It was supposed to be Judge Franklin's case, but he had a heart attack. Is he all right? My mother asked, genuine concern in her voice. He's stable, I said, touched by her question. But that's why I had to step in temporarily. There was an awkward pause before my father spoke again. We saw some of the video. What Heather said to you? His voice broke slightly. No parent wants to hear their child speak to their sibling that way. It's not the first time, I said quietly. Another silence, heavier this time. We know, my mother finally admitted. We've always known, I think. How differently we treated you both. How we favored her. We just never wanted to admit it, even to ourselves. Her words unlocked something in me. A validation I had sought for decades without realizing it. Tears welled in my eyes. Why? I asked simply. Was I such a disappointment? No, they both exclaimed simultaneously. Never that, my father continued. If anything, it was the opposite. You were always so capable, so self-sufficient. You never seemed to need us the way Heather did. She was demanding, fragile. You were strong. So I was punished for being strong. I couldn't keep the bitterness from my voice. We failed you, my mother said, and I heard her crying. We failed you both. In different ways. We gave Heather everything and never taught her to stand on her own. We gave you nothing and forced you to fend for yourself. Both were wrong. It wasn't a perfect apology. But it was perhaps the most honest conversation we'd ever had. By the call's end, nothing was resolved, but something had shifted. They asked if they could visit soon, and I tentatively agreed. Meanwhile, the media coverage exploded. By evening, the courtroom video had gone viral. Judge Sister Showdown, screamed one headline. Fraudster calls Judge Sister worthless, in epic courtroom fail, declared another. My private life was suddenly public property, my professional reputation potentially at risk. The next morning, I met with the court's public relations team. They advised a brief statement acknowledging the relationship and emphasizing the court's commitment to impartiality, which was why I had recused myself. I agreed, wanting to minimize the circus atmosphere without appearing to hide. My colleagues were surprisingly supportive. Judge Lawrence, who had taken over Heather's case, stopped by my chambers. For what it's worth, he said, your sister was much more subdued in my courtroom. Her attorney has requested a psychiatric evaluation before proceeding further. I nodded, not trusting myself to comment on Heather's case. The professional boundary was essential now more than ever. The next week passed in a blur. I took a few days off, then returned to work, focusing intently on my cases while avoiding public areas of the courthouse. The chief judge had temporarily reassigned me to civil matters to keep me away from the criminal division where Heather's case was proceeding. Then, unexpectedly, I received a request through official channels. Heather wanted to see me, not in court, but in a supervised visit at the detention center where she was being held pending her psychiatric evaluation. My first instinct was to refuse. What could possibly be gained from such a meeting? But after consulting with the court's ethics advisor, who confirmed that a personal visit unrelated to her case would not violate any judicial canons, I decided to go. The detention center was a stark contrast to the luxury Heather had known. I was led to a private visitation room typically reserved for attorney-client meetings. When Heather was brought in, the transformation shocked me. Gone was the designer clothing, replaced by a standard-issue jumpsuit. Her hair hung limply around her face, her makeup-free complexion pale and drawn. For a long moment, we simply stared at each other across the table. Then, to my astonishment, she began to cry. I didn't believe it was really you, she said between sobs. When Martin told me my sister was the judge, I thought he was confused or lying. It seemed impossible. I remained silent, waiting for her to continue. You're really a judge, she said, as if still trying to convince herself. An actual judge. How did that happen? Years of hard work, I replied simply. Law school. Public defender. Prosecutor. It wasn't overnight. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. No one ever told me. Would you have cared if they had? I asked, not unkindly but honestly. She didn't answer directly. I've lost everything, Mackenzie. My homes, my money, my reputation. Jason's probably going to divorce me from prison. Mom and Dad are broke because of me. And now I find out my little sister, who I've spent my whole life looking down on, is successful enough to be appointed a judge. I'm sorry for your troubles, I said carefully, but I can't discuss your case. I'm not asking you to, she replied. I don't understand how everything got so messed up. I was supposed to be the successful one. The rawness of her admission struck me. For the first time, I saw beyond the golden child to the deeply insecure woman beneath. Success isn't just about money or status, Heather. It's about integrity, purpose, making a difference. She laughed bitterly. Easy for you to say from your side of the bars. I've had my own struggles, I countered. Different from yours, but real nonetheless. We talked for nearly an hour. Not resolving decades of dysfunction, but at least acknowledging it existed. As our time ended, Heather asked the question I'd been dreading. Do you hate me? After everything I said in that courtroom, after all these years. I considered my answer carefully. I don't hate you. I don't know if I ever really knew you enough to hate you. We were set against each other from the beginning, by circumstances neither of us created. Can that ever change? She asked, vulnerability evident in her voice. I don't know. I answered honestly. But it can't change while I'm involved in any way with your legal case. Maybe after, if that's something we both want. As I left the detention center, I felt emotionally drained but somehow lighter. The confrontation that had seemed so catastrophic had forced open doors long kept shut. Nothing was resolved. But at least the pretenses had been stripped away. The following weeks brought more changes. My parents came to visit as promised, our conversations awkward but increasingly genuine. They marveled at my apartment, my chambers at the courthouse, the respect I commanded among my colleagues. It was as if they were seeing me for the first time. "We're so proud of you," my father said, the words I'd longed to hear for decades finally spoken aloud. "We should have told you that long ago." Professionally, the incident eventually faded from headlines as newer scandals took its place. The chief judge informed me that the Judicial Ethics Committee had reviewed the situation and found that I had handled it appropriately under difficult circumstances. My reputation, if anything, had been enhanced by the dignified way I'd responded to Heather's outburst. Heather's case proceeded without my involvement. Her psychiatric evaluation resulted in a diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder exacerbated by substance abuse. She accepted a plea deal that included mandatory treatment along with a reduced prison sentence. Jason received a much harsher sentence, the evidence against him overwhelming. 6 months after the courtroom confrontation, I visited Heather at the federal prison where she was serving her time. She looked healthier, the clarity of sobriety evident in her eyes. "The therapist says I've spent my whole life defining myself by external validation," she told me. "Looks, popularity, money, status. I never developed a real sense of self." "And now?" I asked. "Now I'm learning who I am without all that," she said. "It's terrifying, but also freeing in a way. I don't have to be perfect anymore." It wasn't a fairy tale reconciliation. The damage of our childhood couldn't be undone in a few conversations. But it was a beginning, a tentative bridge across the chasm that had separated us for so long. As for me, the experience changed my approach to judging in subtle but important ways. I became more attuned to the family dynamics often at play in criminal cases, more aware of how privilege and neglect shape different paths in life. I established a mentoring program for underprivileged youth interested in legal careers, hoping to provide the guidance and support I had lacked. And slowly, cautiously, I began to build a more balanced life outside the courtroom. I started dating Mark, a professor of literature who was refreshingly unimpressed by my title and more interested in my thoughts on justice and philosophy. I renovated my apartment, making it a true home rather than just a place to sleep between workdays. I even adopted a cat, something I'd always wanted but never thought I had time for. The greatest change, though, was internal. For years, I had driven myself relentlessly, trying to prove my worth to a family that wasn't watching. The courtroom confrontation had forced me to see that I no longer needed that validation. My worth had never depended on their recognition of it. In the most unexpected way, my sister's public rejection had finally set me free. 6 months became a year, then 2. Life settled into new patterns, some surprising, others long overdue. Heather served her sentence at a minimum security federal prison in Connecticut, where I visited monthly. These visits, awkward at first, gradually evolved into something resembling a real relationship, perhaps the first we'd ever had. The irony is, Heather told me during one visit, her prison-issue uniform a far cry from her designer wardrobe of the past. "I spent my whole life thinking I was winning some competition between us, and you weren't even playing the game." I smiled at her insight. I was playing an entirely different game, one with different rules and different measures of success. "And you were winning all along," she acknowledged. I just couldn't see it. Heather's journey through the legal system had been mercifully shorter than initially feared. Her cooperation with authorities investigating Jason's broader network of fraud had substantially reduced her sentence. More importantly, she had embraced the rehabilitation programs available to her, working with a therapist to address the deep-seated insecurities that had driven her destructive behaviors. Jason, meanwhile, had received 15 years. He filed for divorce 6 months into his sentence, attempting to distance himself from Heather in hopes of a more sympathetic appeal. The divorce was finalized with little fanfare. Another chapter closed. My parents underwent their own transformation during this period. The financial devastation wrought by their years of supporting Heather's lifestyle had forced them to completely rebuild their retirement plans. My father continued working as a night security guard, while my mother took a part-time job at a local library. The humbling of their circumstances seemed to bring a new perspective. We always thought money and status were the measure of success. My father admitted during a Sunday dinner at my apartment, now a monthly tradition. We pushed Heather in that direction because it was what we valued. We ignored your achievements because they didn't fit our narrow definition of success. But look at us now, my mother added, gesturing around my modest but comfortable home. You're the one with stability, purpose, respect. We were wrong about so many things. These acknowledgments, while healing, couldn't erase decades of favoritism and neglect. Our relationship remained a work in progress, boundaries carefully maintained. I had learned to forgive without forgetting, to accept their love without needing their approval. On a crisp autumn day nearly 3 years after the courtroom confrontation, Heather was released from prison. Against all expectations, including perhaps my own, I was there to pick her up. She emerged through the gates looking both older and somehow younger than before, the artificial polish of her former life stripped away, revealing the authentic woman beneath. Her hair, once professionally highlighted and styled, now showed natural streaks of gray. Her face, free of fillers and Botox, displayed the natural lines of a woman in her early 40s. You came, she said simply, stopping a few feet away from me. I said I would, I replied, and after a moment's hesitation, we embraced briefly. The drive back to Boston was filled with careful conversation, both of us navigating this new terrain of actual sisterhood. Heather would be staying in a halfway house for 6 months as part of her release conditions, working at a local nonprofit that helped formerly incarcerated women reintegrate into society. It's not exactly the career I imagined, she said with a wry smile, but it feels right. Using my experience to help others avoid my mistakes. That's more meaningful than anything you did before, I observed. She nodded. I know that now. Over the following months, Heather's transformation continued to surprise me. She embraced her community service hours not as a punishment, but as an opportunity. She lived frugally, learning to budget for the first time in her adult life. Most importantly, she took responsibility for her actions without the deflection and blame that had characterized her pre-prison personality. My own life had evolved as well. My relationship with Mark had deepened into something solid and nurturing. He had proposed 6 months earlier, and we were planning a small wedding for the spring. My mentoring program for underprivileged youth interested in legal careers had expanded to 3 district courts, with several former men's now in law school. As a judge, I had earned a reputation for fairness tempered with compassion. My experience with Heather had given me unique insight into the complexities of human behavior, the ways privilege and neglect shape choices, and the possibility of genuine redemption. This perspective informed my sentencing decisions, particularly for first-time offenders showing true remorse. You're different on the bench now, a veteran court reporter observed after a particularly challenging sentencing hearing. Still tough when necessary. But there's a depth of understanding that wasn't there before. She was right. The courtroom confrontation with Heather had changed me in profound ways. Where I once saw cases in black and white, I now perceived the full spectrum of gray. My own pain had opened me to the pain of others, creating space for both justice and mercy. On the 2nd anniversary of Heather's release, we met for dinner at a quiet restaurant in Cambridge. She had completed her probation and was working full-time at the nonprofit, recently promoted to program coordinator. I had been appointed to the appellate court, a significant advancement in my judicial career. Who would have thought we'd end up here? Heather mused, raising her water glass in a toast. The golden child and the forgotten one, both finding our way to something real. I smiled, clinking my glass against hers. Life has a way of balancing the scales eventually. I've been thinking a lot about that day in court, she said, her expression turning serious. When I called you worthless in front of everyone. I don't think I've properly apologized for that. You have, in many ways, I assured her. She shook her head. Not directly. I was so caught up in my own image, my own importance, that I couldn't see your value. The truth is, you were always the valuable one, Mackenzie. Not because you became a judge or achieved professional success, but because of who you are. Your integrity, your perseverance, your heart. I was the worthless one, building my life on appearances and lies. The acknowledgement brought unexpected tears to my eyes. We both have worth, Heather. Different strengths, different paths, but equal value. It took us a long time to see that. Better late than never, she replied with a gentle smile. Later that night, as Mark slept beside me, I reflected on the extraordinary journey of the past few years. The public humiliation that had seemed so catastrophic had ultimately been the catalyst for healing lifelong wounds. The sister who had once made me feel invisible now truly saw me, perhaps for the first time. The parents who had overlooked me now expressed pride in my accomplishments. Yet the most profound change was within myself. I no longer measured my worth by others' recognition of it. The validation I had unconsciously sought for decades had finally come. Not from external sources, but from the quiet certainty of knowing my own value. The courtroom where Heather had called me worthless had become the very place where that false narrative was finally, irrevocably shattered. In the eyes of the law, in the eyes of society, and most importantly in my own eyes, I was worthy. Not because of my title or position, but because of the person I had become despite, or perhaps because of the challenges I had faced. This is the true measure of success, not wealth or status or power, but the ability to stand firmly in your own truth, to live with integrity even when no one is watching, to find purpose in service to others, and to extend grace to those who once caused you pain. If you've ever felt undervalued or overlooked in your own family, I hope my story gives you strength. Sometimes the person others fail to see becomes the person impossible to ignore. Sometimes the validation we seek from others can only truly come from within. And sometimes, the greatest revenge against those who called you worthless is not proving them wrong, but forgiving them anyway. What challenges have you overcome to find your own worth? Share your story in the comments below. And if this journey resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share with someone who might need to hear that their value isn't determined by others' recognition of it. Thank you for listening, and remember, your worth was never in question, even if others failed to see it.